Hi, I'm Joe Walensky, and I am the president of WritersUA, and we are getting ready for our conference coming up in Denver, WritersUA West. That's going to be held in cooperation with Metropolitan State University, and I get a chance to talk with our speakers, and right now I'm talking with Everett McKay. Hi, Everett. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, Joe. How are you?
Yeah, it's good. It's a halfway decent day here in Seattle where I'm at. Where are you speaking to us from today?
Well, I'm in beautiful St. Albans, Vermont, and what's interesting today is it's very cold, it's very windy, it's very miserable, and of course that's the way we like it here. So, it keeps the tourists away. So it has its benefits, but it's pretty miserable today. Actually, it's usually not that bad. Everybody thinks, I'm a Southern California native, everybody thinks it's awful in Vermont in the winter. Actually, your typical day is not so bad. It's kind of like the whole rain thing in Seattle. It's kind of overdrawn, but on occasion it's awful, and today's one of those days.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the time for it. Seems like everybody all across the country has been having unusual climate situations. So I guess we just have to keep moving forward. Well, we're getting close to meeting up in Denver, and so you're going to be one of our featured speakers there. I thought we'd start with you just talking a little bit about your background, what you do.
Okay. So my company is UX Design Edge, and what I do is I do UX design training and consulting. And one thing that's a bit unusual is that my background is actually as a developer. I got into UX design as someone writing code. And so my specialty is basically to teach design to primarily technical teams, people who have similar backgrounds that I do. And that's an interesting challenge because, teaching design to developers and technical folks is among, I think, the hardest challenges there are with respect to UX training. And so I focus on training and consulting, and I've written a few books. And just to fill you in a little bit about my background before I started my company is, as you know, actually you gave me an award when I was at Microsoft. So I was at Microsoft for 10 years. Half of that time was spent on working on the Windows User Experience Guidelines. And what was interesting about that experience and what's relevant to the WritersUA conference is that when I was working on guidelines, I discovered that great guidelines were really all about effective human communication. You can have guidelines that are basically do's and don'ts or best practices or conventions or that sort of thing. But the great guidelines I noticed kind of through doing it really kind of boiled down to understanding that what we're trying to do is not just come up with some technical design, but we're trying to communicate to users. And if you think about it from the point of view of communication, everything on the screen is there to communicate something to someone for some reason. And the great thing about that is once you start to think about UI design as a form of human communication as opposed to purely design or purely something that's decorative or visual, that really kind of helps us get insight that we ordinarily don't have because, we can argue about subjective art all day long, but once we think about how to effectively communicate something to someone, that really gives us a framework for making better decisions and being able to communicate to our team and be able to persuade our team what to do.
Well, yeah, of course, from, of the things I've been involved in, it's primarily involved in user assistance, yet, more recently, I've taken more expansive view of how the skills that, I think technical communicators, the skills we have can be applied in maybe a broader umbrella or a definition of user experience. You've kind of come into UX from a little bit of a different direction, but we have some commonalities there. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what the evolution was that positioned you within this UX area.
Well, how I got in the field in the first place, in other words?
Yeah, just kind of how your career ended up to where you're at right now.
I see. So, I hope it's not extremely obvious, but I am a little bit older, on the older side. So, I've been at this for quite a while. And so when I got started as a developer, I don't know how it is today, but certainly when I got started as a developer, so first of all, I was kind of naturally interested in UX design because I felt it was kind of the key to success. But at that time, honestly, most developers wanted nothing to do with it. So, you're working on a team and they're like, would anyone like to work on the UI? And you didn't really see a lot of hands. And I'd raise my hand. So as a developer, I found it was easy to get into UI design if you're interested in, because the opportunities were there. Nobody else wanted to do it. And so that's kind of how I got started, was being that guy who volunteered to do it, and kind of recognizing right off the bat that I didn't do it well. I designed like a programmer, as I like to call it today. And of course, everybody else did as well. We've come a long way since then. But just realizing that, first of all, I thought it was the key to success. I thought it was the most enjoyable part of writing code, the visible part, and just this curiosity of like, okay, I know I'm not doing it well. What do I need to fix? And that's kind of the thing that got me going down this particular road. And so what I then did at one point was I got really interested in trying to teach UI design to developers. One thing led to another, and that led to my job at Microsoft.
Well, you're always coming up with new ideas and getting involved in communicating those ideas to people in the form of books. So you're working on any new publications?
Well, as it happens, I just started, believe it or not, 2, which is crazy. You shouldn't write 2 books at a time. But they're very simple and focused, and working on both of them kind of keeps me more engaged. So I'm doing this crazy idea of working on 2. So the first one has to do with user stories. And so I think that there's something to be said for trying to raise the game in terms of how we use user stories in the agile design process to make it more UX design focused. So that's kind of the topic of the first book. The second one is more along the lines of UX design principles. But what I've come up with isn't really a principle. It's kind of a lighter weight concept than what a design principle is. And I'm really trying to flesh this out, so I don't want to get into too much detail. But the interesting thing about this particular concept is when I first stumble across it, I'm like, well, there's not really anything there. It's just too simple. It's too easy. It's too obvious. There's no point to it. But then I realized, well, I'm using these things all the time, and they really are great to use when you're having conversations. And then it just clicked. I'm like, well, wait a minute. That's really what this is all about. It's kind of like UX design principles, but really the point behind them is to facilitate better conversations about design. That's one of the challenges that we face, is that we tend to view UX design is so subjective. Very often we're talking about what we like, what our personal opinion is, and that makes it very difficult for teams to make decisions. And so the idea behind this, and a lot of other things that I try to do, is try to come up with a better vocabulary, a better framework for having conversations so that we can get away from the subjective personal opinion stuff and have something that's a whole lot more tangible and objective. And the interesting thing about this concept that I'm working with is that even though it seemed a little bit too simplistic at first, I think the great thing about that simplicity is it really kind of facilitates the conversation. It doesn't tell you what to do. What it does is it gives you the questions to ask to figure out what to do. And that's what I'm really liking about it.
Well, you're going to be doing 2 topics at the conference. One of those is entitled User Assistance in Modern Apps, and certainly just what user assistance consists of is evolved quite a lot over the past 10 years or so. Talk a little bit about what you're going to be presenting in that session.
Right. So, I'll do the book plug. Here's a perfect time. So, I've got my new book. It's called Intuitive Design, 8 Steps to an Intuitive UI. And so what I try to address in that book is what exactly intuitive UI is and how to get it. And so my definition of intuitive UI is basically a UI is intuitive when the target users can figure it out without the use of thinking, experimentation, memorization, documentation, or training. So those are kind of the manifestations of unintuitive UI when we have to resort to any of those things. So that's, of course, where user assistance falls into place here. So if we have to go to the user's manual to figure out what to do, that's kind of telling us that something's unintuitive. And what's interesting, an interesting challenge is, just taking a help context or taking an onboarding or taking some coach marks or whatever and just critically looking at it and just simply asking the question, is there a preferable, simple alternative design to what we currently have now, which would eliminate the need for the help in the first place? And the surprising answer very often is yes, that by changing things around a little bit, by adding an affordance, adding a label, using a standard icon, those types of things, that we can very often eliminate the need for help, or alternatively, put the help directly in the UI. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying that user assistance is bad. User assistance is great. But the key difference that I want to make for modern apps is that user assistance is something that should be focused on delivering as much value to the user as possible, as opposed to explaining the unintuitive UI. So that's kind of the shift that I see in modern user experiences, is that the UI to a very large degree should be self-explanatory. The help is there to get you above and beyond what should be obvious. And in your introduction, you were mentioning your own personal shift in focus from user assistance to user experience, and I make the bold claim that UX should be user assistance. Why are they different? Why are they two different things? They should be the same thing. And user assistance then in the formal sense is what goes above and beyond to supplement what we cannot possibly put on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, as well. I mean, UX in terms of those two letters and that label is relatively new with respect to software development, even though it goes back 15 to 20 years now. But a lot of the things that technical communicators are good at and have done for a long time is ask the kinds of questions that today people with labels as interaction designers are doing on a regular basis. And so our skill set can deliver us to a really good place to those kinds of opportunities. And so
Right.
I'm always looking to evangelize the idea that that as communicators we want it to be as front end as possible in that user interface. So that'd be a great session to hear you talk about.
Right.
The other one that you're going to have is UX persuasion with lighthouse examples. So what's going to happen there?
Well, so as I mentioned, I do training, and one of the workshops that I did was for a technical, or actually user assistance team, technical writing team at a company that has a very sophisticated, very complex, very scientific product. And what was interesting about that particular workshop was they said, you know what, we're not designers. We're not going to be designing stuff. But what we do is user assistance writers is we help, doing what we just talked about, right? So the interesting twist there was that I came up with a concept where the point of the workshop wasn't to design a UI. Rather, it was to take an existing UI, figure out how to change it in order to reduce the need for user assistance. And then the interesting part was sell that to your team, right? So it's one thing to come up with a better design. It's another to get a team on board. And so this idea of being persuasive has been a very common theme in a lot of my material. Just trying to be, just recognizing that if you can't sell it to your team, it doesn't really matter. You have to be persuasive. Are you still there?
Yep.
Okay, I lost your video. That's good. So just to take it one step further, for this very same team, I was meeting with someone and I said, well, you really need to try to make your UIs more intuitive. And his response was, that's impossible. We have a product that cannot possibly be made intuitive. And so I'm thinking, well, that's kind of an interesting claim to make. I certainly believe that it's possible, and my experience shows that, but how do I convince someone else who is convinced that a certain design objective cannot be achieved? And what I realized is that any sort of argument I could make, or any sort of hypothetical claim I could make, or any sort of design principle I could refer to, that's not going to change anybody's mind. The only thing you could possibly do to change someone's mind in that situation is to actually show that they're wrong. You need to be able to take an example of a UI and be able to set some sort of standard with something real in order to persuade someone that a design objective like this is possible. So that's where the lighthouse example came into play. So as it happened, I was at a conference in Scotland, UX Scotland, and a friend of mine, Marcus Kaniga, did a presentation on lighthouse examples, designing through lighthouse examples. And I thought, well, that's the perfect solution to this particular problem, to come up with a lighthouse example to kind of set a direction for a team to strive for. And the particular thing I'm trying to go for here, again, is a great user experience that isn't so dependent upon people learning stuff through documentation, user assistance, through YouTube videos or whatever. Try to demonstrate and convince a team that this is something you can do.
And I think there's also sorry about that. There's also just the issue of the integration of different types of information, and so it may be that an onboarding can be helpful for people that don't have a familiarity with a particular new interface, and so then it's a matter of how do you do that effectively? How do you keep that immersive, as opposed to 20 years ago you'd go to an external tutorial, you'd go to something separate from that user interface. But today, with most modern apps, it's expected that it's built in, especially with mobile apps. And so, as we have complexity, certainly there's going to be still the need to be able to explain things. And I think just a big part of that is being embedded in the team, so that information is always keeps the user immersed in what their task at hand is.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the objective behind both of my talks. Actually, is to get the user assistance team out of the explaining the unintuitive UI business and get them into adding value to the product business. And so, like in the case of onboarding, and I'm going to be very explicit about this in my talk. The goal is to not say that onboarding is bad, but my goal is to say that onboarding to explain unintuitive UI is bad. So proper onboarding for a modern app is going to be all about demonstrating the value of the product, which is absolutely crucial. I can't remember the number. Maybe I should look this up and memorize it for the conference, but there's some crazy number like, what is it? Something like half the people that don't download a mobile app. In fact, you might have this in your book. You've got these statistics, right? So there's like a 50-50 chance that once you download a mobile app and use it once, you'll never go back to it again, right? So you've got this critical moment, that first experience that you have with the mobile app. You've got to absolutely sell the user that this is a fantastic product that they want to use and continue to use. If you just take for granted that they've downloaded it and they're going to be loyal to the product for an extended period of time, the numbers do not bear that out. That is not what people are generally doing. So that initial experience is absolutely crucial. So do you want to spend that experience explaining to the user why your app is awesome and it's so much better than the alternatives, or do you want to show them what the controls mean?
And I think as you move from consumer-facing apps to enterprise apps, there's more of an expectation that people have work time to be able to understand a product in more detail. And so that's where I think then the value that what we do for user assistance is less about user interface and more about how you're bringing your understanding of what your value is to your business and how to apply that to a particular tool. So
absolutely. It's all about value.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about this for a few minutes, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Denver at MSU.
All right. Awesome. Joe, thanks for the opportunity, and I'll see you next month.
All right. Thanks a lot, Everett. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.